Hello, everybody. In this presentation, I'd like to repeat what we shared at the January network meeting. Um, for those who weren't able to be there, or for anyone who would like to revisit the points that we discussed. And really, this is about our co-production as a network of the theory of change um, model. It's the second iteration that we've used, so we've already discussed and consulted on this. And so this version contains some revisions in light of your responses and comments. So before I share it with you, I'd just like to go through a few of the underpinning principles and ideas that hopefully will give the theory of change a little bit more of a context. The first point that I think we now all recognize is that developing a theory of change is a long-term and iterative process. It's not something that is done quickly or easily or even finally. It's something that is likely to develop and evolve over time, and that's good. That is useful. The second point is that there is no perfect or ideal theory of change. There's a lot of variability in terms of the particular context, the kinds of initiatives, interventions, the people that are involved, and the purposes as well. So there's always going to be some degree of negotiation between um, those different contexts, initiatives, purposes, and personnel as well. However, there are some generally accepted criteria which a theory of change should hopefully meet or work towards meeting to be useful and fit for purpose. For us, the most important is that it is coherent and usable, and that the lines highlighted in red are the things we're really focusing on at this time now. We want to really learn from you whether the second iteration of the theory of change is clear and understandable, and is it presented in a way that it can be useful, usable, and helpful in some way. And I suspect that the answer is not a clear yes on these things. So in that case, we're looking for ways that we can revise, refine, and improve this version of the theory of change into a third iteration. The second broad criteria is about analysis of the context. So again, in red, does the theory of change make sense as a response to our context, the problems and the changes needed? And the third area that we're looking at the moment, again in red, concerns the hypotheses of change, the theory itself. So are the causal pathways between different processes within the theory, are they mapped? And does that mapping make sense? In terms of the level that the theory of change is working, it could potentially be a general theory of change that's quite overarching across a complex system, or it could be a more local level specific theory of change, perhaps implemented by a particular agency or organization. We think for the Bristol Active City Network, we need a general theory of change for the work of the network. So it therefore needs to be flexible and open enough that it could be applied across a range of different and diverse contexts. That's what we're working towards with this theory of change. The problems with some of the problems with that means that it's not actually going to necessarily suit a specific initiative. So it's likely that the general theory of change that we arrive at will need to be modified to make uh, more closely relevant to the particular context um, of the project, the initiative that you're working on. The vision statement that the network has agreed to date is on the screen now, and this is important in terms of providing a beacon that we're working towards in the long term through the theory of change process. The aims are also important. On the right in black, were the aims we had drafted during the first iteration. Again, in response to your feedback, we've made these revisions to the aims. It may be that further revisions are needed for the network as a whole across these three areas. We welcome those when appropriate. Here then is the model, the schematic for the second iteration of the theory of change. You'll recognize there's a lot in common with the first version and some developments and differences. It's likely, I think, that there will need to be some further refinements of that, and we're very keen to learn from you what those refinements need to be. So I'll talk through this again for the benefit of those who weren't at the network meeting or would like some further clarification on this. So we've taken a level of foundational inputs. These are the yellow boxes along the bottom, and you'll recognize these as three of the cross-cutting conditions of change that have come from Sport England and NELP. This time we have made a more clear focus on community engagement. It's something that's come out of discussions repeatedly, that this is core, this is a priority, and it's something that while we have beacons of excellence in this area, it's something that we could benefit from improving. So our starting point, the black arrow at the bottom, is to come into the foundational inputs at the level of community engagement. From there, we have arrows going either or both ways towards identifying the factors that influence participation for the target group, that particular community perhaps, and then also collaboration across organisations. So these are things that we would agree with Sport England are necessary at a foundational level for us, our network, to have the best chance of being successful in terms of promoting greater equity and equality in physical activity and reducing the inequalities that we're all very familiar with now. The double-headed arrows suggest that in practice we could move from community engagement in either or both of those directions simultaneously, and we may well flow back along across and between those three foundational inputs. From there, the hypothesis would be that we then move onwards to the delivery inputs. Here again, the arrows go from any of the three boxes at the bottom to any of the three orange boxes in the middle level. And once again, we may move between those different processes, those different stages in any combination. And this, I suppose, is an illustration of the general level of the theory of change that I mentioned before, that actually we can't really specify a specific process. It needs to be more organic, more flexible, more attuned to the needs of a particular initiative, community, or group of professionals. So we have from right to left collective leadership, cultures and practices of physical activity, the literal delivery of that, and then the environment, perhaps the physical environment, perhaps more, that within which the initiative, the activity will be taking place. From here, we're moving into the level of outputs and outcomes. Once again, these are very general at this stage. So it's quite a big step to the blue circle here of transforming attitudes, opportunities, and behaviors. This is the change that we theorize is necessary for us to move towards our aims and ultimately the vision statement. From here, the process would be to the new purple circle here of sustaining and reinforcing transformations over time. So again, you fed back to us that the transformations of attitudes, opportunities, and behaviors have been happening historically. However, one of the problems is they haven't necessarily been sustained over time. They haven't necessarily been reinforced in terms of being strengthened or extended or expanded. So this seems to be a critical area of focus. From here, we're moving towards the green circle, now phrased in terms of equity rather than inequality in physical activity participation across the city, the longer term vision. So it may be that further nuance or greater specificity is needed in terms of these outputs and outcomes. Um, we again would like to hear from you about that. And the challenge for us as a collective is to what to include here to bring that greater detail while also retaining the coherence and a degree of simplicity to the model. We are dealing with a complex system, so if we make the model overly complex as well, it's going to be very difficult potentially for us to use and work with to actually make sense of. And I've certainly seen some theory of change that examples that fall into that category, I think. So another major change from the first version is that the cycles of learning and action now isn't its own box within the model, but actually an all-encompassing, ongoing process that we've represented here with the red around the edge of the model. And really, it's trying to say that it's everywhere and all the time, potentially, that the cycles of learning and action are taking place. So they could be happening at the very earliest stages, the planning stages of a project, the foundational level. It could be during delivery. It could be following some sorts of outputs or outcomes from the project, or it could be a combination of those. And it's those cycles of learning and action that we see as necessary for developing our work across the city in a way that has the best chance of leading to the kinds of changes that we're oriented towards. So this model, this schema is quite general and quite broad. We'll just share now a slide on each of those 6 boxes, which we're drawing on now the work in the System Maturity Matrix workshops in September and October, the kinds of issues and areas that you drew out as being important across these 6 stages or processes, the yellow and orange boxes of the model. So starting with community engagement, these are some of the points that you discussed, that you wrestled with, sometimes identifying it, beacons of good practice in these areas, and sometimes identifying gaps. So we phrase them as questions, as things to consider when we begin work on community engagement. These are the kinds of issues that Sport England, NELP, and ourselves as a network are aware of being potentially important. It's likely that not all of these will be important for every initiative, but again, because this is a general level theory, we're trying to be as inclusive as possible. Perhaps there are some further things here that you think would be useful to include at this stage. Another foundational input was identifying factors that influence the participation for the target group. So here are the kinds of questions or prompts to underpin practice in working with this stage of the theory of change model. Some of this, I think, is making that movement from international level in knowledge, understanding, and research through to the grassroots insights and learning that has already happened within that specific locality. So it's the full range of evidence, learning, and experience that needs to be or can usefully be considered for this. In terms of collaboration across organizations, again, here with the kinds of things that you discussed as being important for this particular process. Things to address, things to discuss, things to reflect upon. Moving to the delivery level, we have shaping an environment, perhaps a physical environment, to enable activity. Again, a series of questions and prompts of a quite practical nature that hopefully include some sort of critical reflection as well in terms of who is likely to be catered for and included within this environment or these environments, and who potentially might be excluded. It's particularly relevant when we're thinking about the diversity that we hope to welcome and include within the networks within the initiatives across the city. Some questions around cultures and practices of physical activity here. These are things that for many of you, I'm sure, are your bread and butter work. If there's further areas that you do include here that you think would be useful for others to consider and be aware of, please let us know about that. And the final of the 6 boxes is the collective leadership, which there's some repetition here in terms of community engagement, some of these similar issues that perhaps need to be ongoing in terms of their being addressed, being considered through the delivery of an initiative. And finally, the cycles of learning and action, the red around the entire model. The key point in green here is that the cycles of learning and action can potentially be woven through all phases of initiative, and that can be a useful and important practice. And then some of the considerations that might be useful in terms of reflecting on and actioning these cycles of learning.